Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. If you're still here after all that, you already know the kind of stories we tell. The kind that crawl under your skin, that echo in the quiet when the episode ends. If you want to carry a piece of that darkness with you, wear what haunts you. Our exclusive line of merch is made for listeners who feel more at home in the uncanny, the unspoken, the things that don't make sense in the daylight. Shirts, hoodies, and other gear, designed with that same atmosphere of dread, mystery, and whispered wrongness. Candles support the channel, feed the stories. You can grab yours at https://theshadowsprintify me, and as always, don't look behind you. Chapter 1. The valley below the map. Evan Lee had always liked forgotten places. He said they felt honest. The world didn't pretend for you in places like that. It just showed you what time and neglect could really do. That was what drew him to Dunridge Hollow, a smudge of a town clinging to the mountainside in southern West Virginia. It wasn't on most maps anymore. The last census had listed 77 residents, but that was 15 years ago, and half the houses he passed on the drive-in had their windows caved or boarded up, ivy threading through the gaps like the mountain was slowly swallowing its mistakes. The road wound through black oak and red maple, the trees pressing close enough that branches scraped the sides of his car. The air grew colder as he descended, the kind of cold that smelled metallic, like wet rock and old rust. At the base of the valley, a single strip of asphalt cut through a few skeletal storefronts. A diner, a shuttered general store, a post office with no flag outside. He parked beside a gas pump that hadn't worked in years. A man was sitting out front of the diner, hunched on the steps, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. He looked like he'd been carved out of the same rock as the valley. Thin, angular, his face lined deep from decades underground. Evan offered a wave as he got out, but the man didn't wave back. He just nodded once, eyes flicking to the gear strapped to Evan's backpack. Tent, bedroll, camera, compass. Camping? The man asked, voice rasping like coal dust. Evan nodded. Just a few nights. Thought I'd explore around Briar Hollow Mine. I heard it was sealed back in the 70s. Figured I'd take some photos of what's left. The man's expression barely moved, but something behind his eyes hardened. He took a drag, then exhaled smoke slow, deliberate. They sealed that place for a reason, he said. Best you just take your pictures from the road. Evans smiled politely. It's all condemned, I know. I won't go inside. Just curious. The man gave a small, dry chuckle, but it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. Curious, he muttered. That's what they all say. He flicked his cigarette into the dust and stood, walking back toward the diner door. Before disappearing inside, he added, Sun goes down early in this valley. Best not be out there after dark. Evan watched him go, uneasy but determined. He'd come too far to turn around now. He spent the afternoon following an old service road that wound deeper into the mountains. The trees grew denser, their branches knotted like veins across the sky. Every so often he'd pass remnants of the old mining operation. A half-buried cart, a splintered beam, the husk of a ventilation pipe jutting from the slope like the bone of some buried animal. By dusk, he reached a clearing overlooking the valley floor. Below him, the mountain's face yawned open where the mine once breathed. The entrance had been sealed decades ago with a wall of poured concrete, now cracked and overgrown with moss. Someone had spray-painted a warning across it long ago, most of it washed away by rain, leaving only 2 legible words, "Stay out." The air here was different, still heavy, almost wet. He could taste iron on the back of his tongue. He set up camp beneath a sycamore at the edge of the clearing. As the last light faded, he turned on his lantern and sat outside the tent, watching mist gather in the trees. Somewhere deep in the dark, a single bird called and fell silent. That was when he first heard it. At first, it was just wind, or what he thought was wind. A faint, breathy tone slipping between the trees, low and uncertain, like the sound of someone blowing gently through a hollow tube. Then the note shifted. Rose fell, curved. A rhythm emerged, a pattern too deliberate to be nature. Whistling. It came from the direction of the mine. soft, distant, echoing through the valley like it had traveled miles underground just to reach him. Evan froze, his body thrumming with adrenaline, trying to listen past the hammering in his chest. The sound lasted only a few seconds, then faded, leaving the night raw and empty again. He waited. Nothing. Finally, he exhaled, half laughing at himself. Maybe it had been wind in the vent shafts, or pressure equalizing through some old tunnel system. Nothing supernatural about it. Still, when he crawled into his tent and zipped the flap, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sound hadn't come from the mountain itself, but from somewhere inside it, and that whatever had made it had been waiting for him to hear. Chapter 2, The Hollow in the Hills. The drive into Ridgetop Hollow took longer than expected. The roads wound like old veins through the Appalachian hills, bordered by sagging fences and skeletal trees that hadn't known spring in years. Owen hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. Just the endless looping of the same ridges, green-grey and heavy with mist, their crowns lost in low, dragging clouds. He pulled over once, not because he wanted to, but because the silence inside the truck started to feel like pressure. He killed the engine and sat there, the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal echoing too loud in the absence of anything else. The GPS had lost signal somewhere back on County Road 12. No radio, no cell bars, just the sound of the wind breathing through the mountains, a sound that almost, but not quite, carried a note to it. He stepped out. The air was colder than it should have been for late October. The road dust clung to his boots and seemed to breathe upward, as if the ground itself exhaled. He could smell coal even out here, an acrid tang that belonged to the kind of mines you only read about now, the ones that took more men than they ever paid. He'd heard about the place from an online hiking forum. Ridgetop Hollow Loop, the post said. A forgotten trail over an old mine seam, great views, local legends. It had been just vague enough to spark curiosity and just obscure enough to promise solitude. Owen wasn't much of a believer in legends, but lately he'd been trying to get away from people altogether. As he got back into the truck and drove on, the land began to open, less dense trees, a widening sky the color of tarnished steel. He spotted the first sign of civilization at the bottom of the hollow, a warped wooden sign leaning sideways in the mud. RIDGTOP mine, closed 1971. Trespassers will be PROSECUTD. The letters were faded, eaten away by weather and time, but the warning stood out sharp as bone against the fog. The trailhead was just beyond it. He parked, killed the engine, and stepped out again. The world had gone still. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed hesitant here. He slung his pack over his shoulder and started toward the tree line, where the path disappeared into the grey. The soil underfoot was dark and soft, and as he walked, it seemed to carry a faint glitter, tiny flecks of black stone catching what little light filtered through the fog. Cold dust, old maybe, but still there. The trail wound inward fast, curling through thickets of laurel and slick moss-covered stones. He followed it for what felt like an hour, losing all sense of direction until he reached the first marker, an old ventilation shaft, now sealed with a rusted metal grate. The air that leaked from it was colder than winter, and with it came that faint, almost imperceptible note again. At first he thought it was wind, a hollow whine passing through metal, but then it held a shape, not random, not wind, a whistle, 3 long notes rising slightly at the end. Owen froze. Every instinct told him it was just the structure settling, maybe air pressure or a bird caught below, but there were no birds here. No sound except that thin, trembling whistle echoing up from beneath his boots. He knelt, pressing his ear near the grate. It stopped immediately, dead silence. He stood again and turned in a slow circle, scanning the fog-thick trees. Nothing. Still, as he walked away, the sound returned, this time softer, further ahead, as if whatever was making it had moved. The deeper he went, the more the trail seemed to change. The earth grew darker, damper. The air carried that same coal scent, thick and metallic now, like blood left to dry. He reached the clearing where he planned to camp just before dusk, a wide basin surrounded by low rock walls and twisted pines. He unpacked quietly, trying to ignore the unease building behind his ribs. He built a small fire, ate cold beans from a can, and listened to the woods settle. It was only after the fire burned low that he heard it again, clearer now. 3 notes, not close but not far enough. A whistle echoing through the hollow. This time it didn't stop when he moved. It answered when he breathed. And when he finally laid down to sleep, he dreamed of black tunnels under his feet, wet walls, faint voices, and a breath in the dark that whistled when it exhaled. Chapter 3, The Breath Beneath the Hills. Owen woke before dawn, not because of the cold, but because something had ended his dream too suddenly. The fire had died to ash. The mist had thickened, and the grey half-light made the world look like it had been half erased. For a few seconds he didn't move. He just listened. The forest was still. But underneath that stillness was a low hum, almost imperceptible, like a vibration traveling through the ground. When he placed his hand on the soil beside him, he swore he could feel it, a faint, steady pulse. He sat up and tried to laugh it off. Too many stories on the internet. Too much caffeine the day before. He told himself he'd just hike out, grab some photos, and leave before the fog burned off. But when he glanced down, he froze. His hands, his fingernails were blackened. Not completely, not like they'd been dipped in soot, but there was dark residue under every nail, packed deep into the cuticles. He rubbed at it, and the scent hit him. Burnt dust and iron. Coal, the same stuff from the ventilation shaft. He didn't remember touching the grate. He didn't remember anything after he'd zipped into his tent and drifted off. He scrubbed his hands against his jeans until his skin turned raw, but the black didn't come out. It had settled too deep, like it had been pressed there while he slept. He packed up faster than he ever had. No breakfast. Just threw everything into his bag and started toward the trail. The fog was so thick it felt like walking through breath. The trees emerged as shapes only when he was nearly on top of them. Every sound was dampened, and the crunch of his boots on the coal-rich soil seemed swallowed before it could echo. By the time he reached the ventilation shaft again, the hum in the ground had grown stronger. He crouched beside the grate. The air leaking up was cold enough to sting his eyes. And then, again, that whistle. But this time it came not from below, but from somewhere ahead in the fog. 3 notes. Long, rising at the end. Clear, deliberate. Owen's mouth went dry. He tried to call out, "Hello," but his voice came out too small. The sound bounced back at him, warped by the fog, until it didn't even sound human anymore. He stood there for a long minute, waiting for an answer. None came. The path curved downhill beyond that point, winding toward the sealed mine entrance marked on his map. The closer he got, the more the air changed. It grew thicker, almost oily, and the smell of coal became unbearable, like burnt earth mixed with something sour and organic. When the mine came into view, it was nothing like he'd imagined. The entrance wasn't fully sealed. The boards were old and rotted, nailed haphazardly decades ago. The chain-link fence surrounding it had been pulled down in places. Something had been here. Recently. He approached slowly. The mist clung to the edges of the tunnel, making it look deeper than it probably was. He crouched to look closer, and that's when he saw them. Footprints, bare ones, pressed deep into the black mud. They trailed from the tunnel out toward the clearing, and then simply vanished into the fog. Owen's heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself they could be old, maybe left by some trespassers, kids exploring. But the edges were too crisp, the impressions still damp. And each print seemed wrong. The toes too long, the arch too flat, the spacing inconsistent, as if the thing that made them didn't quite remember how to walk like a person should. He took a step back. The mist rolled closer, thickening around his legs. Then, faintly from within the tunnel, came another whistle. Not 3 notes this time. 4, the last one lingered, almost like it was waiting for an answer. He ran then, not all the way back to camp, not yet, but enough to put distance between him and that tunnel. Enough that when he finally stopped, lungs burning, the fog had thinned a little. The woods around him looked normal again, harmless even. But when he caught his breath and looked down at the trail, he noticed something new. Small streaks of black along the path where he'd stepped. Coal dust. And in between his own footprints, a second set, lighter, following, fresh. Chapter 4, The Mind Makes Shadows. By the time Owen reached his camp again, the morning fog had thinned into long, curling ribbons. It drifted low across the hollow, catching in the pines and sinking into the soft black soil. The fire pit was still there, his tent undisturbed, but the place looked wrong somehow, smaller. The air felt too heavy to breathe. He stood in the clearing for a while, hands gripping his pack straps, eyes scanning every tree trunk and shadow. Nothing moved. The forest was quiet in that unnatural way, where silence didn't feel like peace, but like something holding its breath. He forced himself to speak aloud. "Probably just an echo," he said, "or some old shaft still venting air." Hearing his own voice helped a little. It sounded normal, human, rational. He knelt beside the fire pit, stirred the ash with a stick, and tried not to think about the footprints. He told himself it could have been kids, or poachers, or even his imagination. Shadows in the fog playing tricks on his eyes. The human brain could conjure anything in isolation. He knew that. He'd read it in a psychology article once, about hikers who hallucinated voices in the wind when alone too long. That's all it was. He decided he'd stay one more night, get a few photos for the hiking forum, then head home in the morning. But as the day dragged on, the sense of being watched only deepened. When he walked to the creek for water, he could swear he heard the faint crunch of footsteps matching his own, a second too late. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned, the woods stood still, innocent. He found his earlier trail in the soft mud along the bank, but something about it made his chest tighten. His footprints were there, yes, but between them, pressed faintly, were others. Not deep enough to be animal, not wide enough for boots. Bare. He squatted to look closer. The prints were already fading in the damp air, crumbling at the edges like they'd been laid in ash instead of dirt. The surface around them glittered faintly in the light, dusted with tiny black flecks. Cold dust. He wiped his hand across the ground. It smeared like soot. When he lifted his fingers to his nose, it smelled just like the tunnel. That same burnt, mineral tang that clung to his nails when he woke that morning. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He washed his hands in the creek until they went red from the cold. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The forest never quite went quiet, but the noises felt wrong. Every bird call stretched too long, every branch snapped carrying too far. He cooked a small meal near dusk and tried to keep his eyes on the firelight, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the sound from the tunnel. That whistling, those 3 rising notes. It had followed him. He could almost imagine it even now, threading through the trees, carried on a breath that wasn't wind. The sun went down without color, just a slow dimming until the hollow fell into slate gray. Owen stayed by the fire, staring into the coals, afraid to look out into the woods where the darkness thickened between trunks. Then, softly, almost buried in the whisper of night, he heard it. W-H-U, W-H-U, W-H-H-U, 3 notes. Rising at the end, he froze, every muscle locked tight. His eyes darted to the tree line, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, after a pause, 4 notes. The 4th hung in the air like a held breath. Owen's hand drifted to the flashlight beside him. He switched it on, and the beam cut through the fog, slicing across trees and rocks and nothing else. The forest looked dead still, empty. He waited. Minutes passed. The whistle didn't return. Eventually, he exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He put another log on the fire and forced himself to laugh. "Air pressure," he whispered to no one. "Old shafts, maybe, that's all." He repeated it like a mantra. Air pressure, settling rock. The mind makes shadows. By the time he crawled into his tent, the fire had burned low again. The darkness felt thicker than before, and the silence, so absolute, it made his own heartbeat sound too loud. He must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing he knew, there was a faint tapping outside. Not heavy, just soft, repetitive, like fingernails brushing canvas. He didn't move. He just lay there, eyes wide in the dark, listening as it circled his tent once, slow and deliberate. The sound faded near the door flap. Then, one long, low whistle, inches from his ear through the fabric. W-H-H-H-U-O. The air inside the tent went cold. He lay perfectly still until dawn, too afraid to unzip the flap, too afraid to breathe loud enough to be heard. When light finally broke through the thin fabric, he bolted outside. The world was gray again, silent again. But in the wet soil around his tent, he saw them clearly. Footprints, bare, blackened prints, leading away from the tent, and next to them, his own. But his had been stepped over. Chapter 5. The steps that weren't his. Owen didn't sleep after the whistle. He didn't move, didn't even blink for long stretches, just stared at the faint light filtering through the tent fabric, counting his heartbeats until the sky shifted from black to grey. By the time dawn arrived, he was trembling from exhaustion, his thoughts scraping raw against themselves. The first thing he noticed when he stepped out was how quiet the woods had become. Not just still, drained. The world looked bleached out, as if the fog had pulled all the colour out of the trees. His fire pit was cold, his breath visible in the air. And the footprints, they were still there. Owen crouched, his hands shaking as he brushed a thin film of soot from the nearest one. The print was human-shaped, but the toes were too long, the arch collapsed. It wasn't deep, but the edges were black, the soil hardened like it had been burned. The prints led away from his tent and down the slope toward the main trail, right alongside his own. He followed them. The two sets of prints ran parallel, winding through the soft earth in perfect synchronization. When he looked closer, though, he realized the stranger's steps overlapped his in places, sometimes precisely, heel to heel, toe to toe, as though something had been walking inside his tracks. It made no sense. He'd made that trail yesterday evening coming back from the mine. He hadn't left camp again, and yet the newer impressions looked fresher, sharper, like they'd been made hours ago. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had followed him in the night. Maybe they'd been watching him, hiding just beyond the firelight. But why barefoot? Why out here in the freezing mud? And that whistle, that damned whispering whistle. He shook the thought away and started packing. His hands moved automatically, rolling the tent, stuffing gear, tightening straps. The sooner he left, the better. He could make it back to his truck by noon, maybe earlier if he didn't stop. As he slung his pack over his shoulder, something caught his eye. A faint dusting of black grit on the tent fabric, like someone had brushed against it with soot-covered hands. He stared at it for a long time before forcing himself to turn away. The fog had lifted a little, but the air still carried that cold, metallic weight. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of his boots, the soft rasp of fabric, his own breathing. He kept to the trail, trying not to look at the trees, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was matching his pace. Half an hour in, he noticed something odd. The trail didn't look the same. The landmarks he remembered were wrong. The split boulder that should have marked the halfway point was gone. The slope that curved toward the creek now dipped the opposite way. The trees themselves felt rearranged, as if the forest had shifted in the night. He stopped and looked back. His footprints trailed behind him in a neat line, but halfway down the slope, they split. One path continuing forward, the other veering off toward the left, deeper into the fog. There was no sign of where they diverged, just one set, then two. And in the softer patches, he could see them again, the same barefoot prints matching stride for stride. Owen's throat went dry. He crouched to inspect one. The depression was deeper than his own, pressed with more weight. When he touched the center of it, the soil was warm. He yanked his hand back. No, that wasn't possible. He stood there for a long moment, frozen in the pale light filtering through the trees. Every instinct screamed to run, but reason kept him rooted. If he ran now, he'd lose the trail completely. He forced his legs to move, following the path he thought led back to the truck. The woods closed in tighter as he descended. His breath came faster, every sound magnified by fear. When the first whistle came again, it was faint, so distant it could have been wind, 3 rising notes that melted into the fog. He froze. The sound came from behind him this time. He turned. Nothing but trees. Then again, closer. WHHHU, WHHHU, WHHHU. A mocking rhythm, like something breathing through a narrow hole in the dark. He started walking faster, then faster still, until his pace broke into a jog. His heartbeat roared in his ears, but the whistle never fell behind. It moved with him, threading through the trees in short bursts, always keeping distance, never showing itself. By the time he stumbled back into the hollow near his camp, his lungs burned. He stopped, hands on his knees, staring at the ground, and that's when he saw the prints again. Not just his and the barefoot ones, Maury now. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all around the clearing. Some small, some large, some shallow, others pressed deep enough to fill with water. The earth was blackened in rings, like something had circled him again and again during the night. And right at the edge of the clearing, half buried in soot, lay something else. A whistle, carved from what looked like bone. It was cracked down the middle, dark with age. The hole at its base looked melted, as if it had once been exposed to incredible heat. Owen stared at it for a long time, fighting the urge to pick it up. He didn't. But as he turned away and began to run again, really run this time, he could swear he heard it. One soft breath behind him, deep and patient. Whoosh, it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something learning to breathe through human lungs. Chapter 6, The Passenger. The drive back to the truck should have been a relief, but by the time Owen caught sight of the dirt road, the world felt wrong again. Too still, too flat, as if the air itself were holding something in. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his legs trembled, and his lungs burned from the climb, but none of that mattered. All he wanted was to hear the truck's engine, to feel that solid rumble under his feet. When he finally broke through the last line of trees and saw the old Ford sitting alone in the clearing, something like hope surged through him. He half ran the final stretch, stumbling through the mud, his heart pounding. Then he stopped. The driver's door was open. Just a few inches, but open enough to matter. He knew he'd locked it. He'd heard the click himself when he left yesterday morning. And yet, there it was ajar, with a faint line of black residue streaking from the handle down to the door frame. Owen stood frozen at the edge of the clearing. The fog had burned off almost completely now, leaving the hollow exposed in brittle, washed-out daylight. Every sound carried too far. The faint creak of trees, the slow tick of cooling metal as the morning sun hit the truck. He forced himself forward. The closer he got, the clearer the details became. There were prints in the dirt beside the door, bare feet again. The same unnatural shape, the same charred edges pressed deep into the mud. They led from the woods to the truck and stopped right at the open door, as if something had climbed in. Owen's stomach twisted. He circled slowly, checking the back. The tailgate was closed, but the dust on it bore two long handprints, one on each side, smeared downward like something had hung there for a while before slipping off. He reached the driver's door and pushed it open the rest of the way. Coal dust. It coated the floor mats, the seat, even the steering wheel. A fine, black powder that clung to everything like it had been breathed out from someone's lungs. The smell hit him hard, wet stone, iron, and something sweet and foul beneath it, like decay left too long underground. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He touched the seat, and his fingertips came away black. The texture was wrong, too oily, too thick. He wiped them on his jeans, but the smear stayed. He checked the glove box, the back seat, even under the dash. Nothing, no sign of an intruder. And yet every inch of the cabin told him someone had been here. Recently. Something had sat in his seat. Something had breathed. There were faint streaks on the passenger window, too, like fingers dragged through condensation. He leaned closer. They spelled nothing, no pattern, just an aimless smudge trailing toward the handle. But when the light caught the glass, he noticed something written faintly underneath the smear. It was a single word, drawn crudely in the dust. Below. Owen stumbled back from the truck as if struck. His mind flashed to the mine, to that cold exhale from the ventilation shaft. That sound, those 4 notes. Below. He slammed the door and turned toward the woods, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Only the faint echo of the wind moving down the hollow. But even the wind sounded practiced. 3 rising notes, then silence. He got in the truck and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned once, coughed, then died. He tried again, same result. The battery light flickered weakly. His chest tightened. He turned the key a 3rd time, and this time the engine caught, a rough, uneven growl that rattled the frame. He didn't care if it stalled again. He just needed to get out. He threw it into gear, spinning gravel as he pulled away. As the road wound uphill, he dared a glance at the rearview mirror. The clearing was already disappearing behind the bend, but something made him look again. The dust on the rear window was shifting. not blowing away, shifting like disturbed from the inside. A line of black grit slid down the glass, then another. For half a second he saw it, a smudge of movement in the truck bed. Something pale beneath the grime, a shape half curled in the shadows, like the impression of a person lying flat. Then it was gone. Owen nearly lost control of the wheel. He slammed the brakes, throwing the truck into a stop halfway up the slope. The engine coughed and died again, leaving him in ringing silence. He twisted around, staring out the back window. Empty. The bed was empty. He climbed out, circling the truck with shaking hands. The tailgate was cold, damp, but bare. No footprints, no sign of anything. He leaned over the edge. The only thing there was a thin layer of coal dust, and right in the center of it, a single shallow print. A handprint. The fingers were spread too wide. The edges burned black. As he stared, the last of the dust lifted on an invisible breeze and drifted toward him. The smell of iron filled the air again. And then, faint but distinct, from somewhere in the trees above the hollow came that sound. WHHH, WHHH, WHHH. It was close now, closer than ever before. He jumped back into the truck, jammed the key into the ignition again, and this time it roared to life instantly, like it wanted him gone. Gravel sprayed as he sped down the road, and the whistle followed him until the trees thinned and the hollow fell away behind him. But even as he left the hills behind, the smell lingered. The air in the cab felt heavy close. He glanced down at the passenger seat, and there, barely visible against the fabric, was another streak of coal dust. 5 lines, like the drag of a hand resting there. Chapter 7. The taste of coal. The road to town felt longer than it had any right to be. Owen's hands clutched the steering wheel too tight, the fabric of his gloves slick with sweat. The morning fog still hadn't burned off the hills. It hung in slow, stagnant drifts across the hollow, catching sunlight in thin white veins. The world outside his windshield seemed drained of all movement, like it was waiting for something. He tried to tell himself that what he saw in the woods, those prints beside his own, the dark smear of coal dust along the truck door, had to have some simple explanation. Maybe he'd tracked it himself without realizing. Maybe someone else had been camping nearby, a local squatter or a hunter. But every rational thread he tried to hold onto slipped loose the moment his mind returned to that sound. The whistling. He'd heard it again that morning, just faintly, when he'd slammed the truck door and thrown his pack inside, carried by the valley air like a memory. 3 notes, low and drawn out, a tune that didn't belong to anyone alive. By the time he reached Boone Hollow, the town felt hollowed out. Just a scattering of buildings along the main drag. A diner with a flickering open sign. A general store with the same 3 trucks parked outside every morning. And the mine office, now a sagging museum for tourists who never came. He parked near the diner, climbed out, and felt the stillness cling to him. Inside, the air smelled of fried eggs and old coffee. "Morning, stranger," said the waitress. A woman in her 50s with smoker's lines and hair that had once been red. "You look like hell," Owen managed a dry laugh. "Been camping out by the ridge?" "That's so," she said, pouring him a cup without asking. "You picked the wrong place for that." "How's that?" Her eyes flicked toward the single old man sitting in the corner booth, eating biscuits and gravy in silence. "They say the ridge ain't quiet anymore. You hear things up there." Owen stared into his coffee, watching the ripples. "Like what?" The man in the corner spoke without looking up. "Like the mine never stopped working." His voice was gravel, slow, deliberate. When he finally raised his head, Owen saw the cloudy grey of his eyes. A retired miner, no doubt. His hands were thick, veined, a faint black still ground into the cuticles. The waitress shot him a look. "Don't start with that again, Earl." But Earl just smirked. "Let him hear it. He went up there. I can smell the coal on him." Owen blinked, unsure whether the man was joking or not. Yeah, I was near the old tunnels. Didn't think there was much left to see." "There ain't," Earl said. "Not unless it wants you to see it." The diner's humming lights buzzed louder in the pause that followed. Owen felt something small and absurd twist in his chest. Embarrassment, maybe, or fear of seeming paranoid. "I just heard some noise," he muttered. "Sounded like whistling," Earl finished for him. Owen froze. Earl nodded slowly, his expression sinking into something solemn. "That's how it starts. My daddy used to say the mine had its own lungs. It took men deep enough it started breathing through them. First the whistle, then the dark dust, then it calls you by name," the waitress sighed. "Earl, please." But Owen couldn't shake the words. He wanted to ask how the man knew what he'd heard, how he could say that without hearing Owen's story. But something in Earl's tone felt heavier than superstition, like memory. When he left the diner, the morning had dimmed under rolling clouds. His truck sat where he'd left it, but the driver's door was open. He stopped cold. He knew he'd locked it. The key had been in his pocket the whole time. He approached slowly, the sound of his boots crunching on gravel too loud in the silence. The seat was smeared with fresh black streaks. Coal dust, thicker now, ground into the leather. And on the steering wheel, 3 finger marks pressed deep into the grime like something had held it. He touched them once, then pulled back, trembling. They weren't his. The prints were too wide. And along the truck's side window, written in dust, was a faint streak that almost looked like a word, 3 letters, scrawled by a rough fingertip. Hum. Chapter 8. The Mouth of the Hollow. Owen sat in his truck for nearly an hour before starting it again. The word on the window, hum, still ghosted faintly through the dust, no matter how many times he wiped it. The air inside the cab smelled wrong, metallic and earthy, like someone had been grinding rock in the seats. Every breath made him think of buried air, of stale tunnels that hadn't known sunlight in half a century. He told himself he'd go home, that whatever was happening out here wasn't his problem. But as he started the engine, his eyes drifted toward the far end of the street, the squat building with the faded sign reading Boone Hollow Mining Museum. The rational part of him wanted distance. The other part, the one that couldn't stop hearing that whistle echoing through the trees, wanted answers. He parked outside the museum. It was empty, save for an elderly woman behind the front desk with silver hair tied in a loose bun and thick glasses that magnified her pale eyes. She looked up from a ledger when he entered. "Afternoon," she said. "We don't get many visitors this time of year. The mine tour have been closed for, 20 years now." "I'm not here for a tour," Owen said. "Just had some questions. I was camping near the old ridge by the sealed shaft. I heard something whistling." The woman went still for a moment. Her hands, thin, paper-skinned, slowly folded the ledger shut. "I see," Owen hesitated. "That means something to you." She nodded toward a wall lined with black and white photographs, men in helmets with carbide lamps, their faces smeared dark. Used to be stories, even back when it was running. The miners said they'd hear it when someone was going to die, sometimes before a collapse, sometimes before a man just stopped coming out. Her eyes lifted to him again. "My husband was one of them. He heard it too." Owen swallowed. "What happened?" "He went down to check on a new vein one morning. Said he heard a tune, low, like a man trying to pass the time. When they found him, he wasn't dead yet, but he wasn't right. He had coal dust packed under his fingernails so thick they had to scrape it out. Said it was trying to get in." "Get in," she nodded once. "In his lungs, in his mouth." He said the mine was breathing through him. A cold heaviness settled in Owen's stomach. He thought of the word on his truck window. Hum, like the noise a throat makes when the lungs aren't empty. The woman stood and pointed toward a display case near the back of the room. Inside was an old miner's helmet and a set of tools, rusted and cracked from decades underground. Beneath them lay a half-burnt notebook. "That was my husband's. We found it a week after the collapse. You can read it if you want." Owen bent to look closer. Most of the pages were charred, but the writing that remained was faint and scrawled in frantic loops. Only a few words were legible beneath the cracked glass. "It whistles when I stop. It wants the breath." He felt a strange pulse behind his eyes, a ringing in his ears. When he looked up again, the woman was gone. The front door hung open, wind drifting through with a faint hiss like something exhaling through a narrow tunnel. Outside, the clouds had sunk low over the hills. The town felt deserted. Not a single person on the street, not even the sound of cars. He climbed back into the truck, his pulse racing, and turned the ignition. The engine caught, But a second sound came with it, faint but undeniable, weaving through the vent system like air leaking from deep underground. Whistling, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the vents. Owen slammed the radio on, then off. Still there. He pressed his ear close to the dashboard. The whistling stopped. And then something answered it, 3 dull taps from the back of the truck bed, in rhythm with the tune that had just ended. He froze, staring at the rearview mirror. The tarp he tied down over his gear was rippling, slow and uneven, as if something underneath was breathing. Chapter 9. Under the tarp. The tarp rippled again. Not from the wind, there wasn't any. The air outside had gone dead still, heavy as wet cloth. The movement was steady, rhythmic, like something alive shifting just beneath the plastic. Owen sat frozen behind the wheel, both hands locked around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He could feel his pulse behind his teeth, pounding so hard it made his vision swim. Milo would have barked by now, he thought, some old memory surfacing. His dog, back home, long gone. He almost laughed at the absurdity of thinking about a dog in that moment, but fear has a strange way of pulling comfort from ghosts. The tarp shuddered once more, and then went still. He opened the door before he could lose his nerve. The gravel under his boots crunched too loudly. His breath came in quick bursts that fogged the air. Though the cold didn't feel natural, it felt mineral, like the chill from underground stone. "All right," he muttered, voice shaking. "All right, you son of a..." He gripped the edge of the tarp and pulled. Cold dust burst up like smoke. It hit him in the face, burned his throat, filled his mouth with the taste of earth and rust. He staggered back, coughing, waving the air clear. When he could finally see again, his gear was there, the cooler, the backpack, but half covered in a thin black layer. It looked like soot, except for one thing, it wasn't spreading. It had collected in hand-shaped patches, finger-length smears that trailed over the lid of the cooler, over the folded tent poles, even over the handle of his shovel. Something had been touching everything. Owen's stomach twisted. He took a step closer. There at the center of the truck bed was a single lump of something darker than the rest. He bent forward slowly, then stopped when he saw the edges of it glisten wetly. A piece of rock or coal, but too soft, too organic. He reached out with a gloved hand and nudged it. It crumbled apart under his touch, releasing another cloud of dust, and God help him, what looked like bits of nail. Tiny crescent shavings, human, embedded in the black grit. He dropped it immediately and stumbled backward, his boots scraping on the asphalt. Behind him, the wind finally picked up. It whispered through the trees, dragging that faint, too familiar sound with it. A whistle, low and wavering, like someone trying to recall a tune from long ago. He turned in a circle, searching for the source, his flashlight beam slicing through the gathering fog. Nothing. Only empty road and skeletal trees bending over it. Then, from beneath the truck, a slow exhale. He dropped to his knees before he could think, aiming the light under the vehicle. 2 handprints smeared in coal dust marked the undercarriage, fresh, wet, dripping. They led up from the gravel as if someone had been crawling along the road on their stomach. His mind raced. He climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, started the engine. The radio flickered to life with a hiss of static, and buried beneath it, a whistle again, this time unmistakably inside the cab. He tore the knobs off, trying to silence it, but it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was leaking from the air vents. He could hear the wet drag of it between notes, the way lungs sound when they're full of dust. He floored the gas pedal and tore down the mountain road, eyes watering, throat raw from breathing through the taste of coal. The whistling followed, faint but constant, threading through the hum of the tires. When he finally hit the highway, he glanced in the mirror one last time. The tarp in the back was gone, ripped away somewhere along the road. But a faint trail of black dust spiraled up behind him, vanishing into the night like smoke from something still burning far below. Chapter 10. The whistle in the cab. The mountain highway was nothing but a 2-lane vein cutting through black forest and fog. His headlights tunneled ahead in a narrow cone, dust hanging in the beam like ash in still air. The only sound was the hum of tires and the faint, persistent whistling that threaded through every seam of the truck. It was low at first, blending with the engine's vibration. But the longer he drove, the clearer it became. It wasn't random. It rose and fell, 4 notes always the same, like something breathing through a tune. Owen cranked the radio louder. Static blared. He turned on the heater, then off again, fiddled with the vents. No use. The sound slipped between the noise, as if it were woven into the metal itself. He kept one hand tight on the wheel, the other gripping the crucifix that hung from his rearview mirror, a leftover from his mother's car, though he'd never been much for faith. The chain rattled with the bumps, casting pale reflections across the windshield. Then the lights flickered. Not the dashboard, the headlights. For a fraction of a second, the road went dark, and in that instant, Owen thought he saw something reflected in the glass of the speedometer, a shape in the back seat. He jerked the wheel. The truck swerved, tires shrieking against the edge of the asphalt. He steadied it, breathing hard, staring into the rear view. Nothing there, just the long smear of fog and the faint shimmer of his taillights. "Get a grip," he muttered. "You're just tired. You're just—" The whistle cut him off. Louder now, inside the cab. He could feel it, as if it were vibrating in his chest cavity, syncing with his pulse. He reached to turn on the cabin light, but his hand froze halfway. The vent beside his face was exhaling cold air, too cold, and beneath that breath another sound, a wet, gravelly drag, like something trying to clear its throat. He stared at the vent. There was movement, tiny, shifting shapes just inside the slats. Dust, he thought at first, until one of the shapes flexed, dragging a line through the grime. Fingertips, blackened, cracked, pressing from inside the vent. Owen screamed, slammed his palm over the vent grill, and yanked it loose. A puff of air and dust exploded outward, coating the dashboard. The whistling broke off. For a heartbeat, silence filled the truck. Then the breath came back, deeper this time, dragging through the cab like the mine itself had inhaled. The crucifix swung wildly from the mirror. Cold dust spiraled through the air like smoke, forming patterns in the light. In the windshield reflection, just behind his own terrified eyes, he saw a mouth, small, impossibly human, open in the back seat. Lips black with dust. No teeth, just darkness. The whistle started again. Owen slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed, skidding sideways until it stopped inches from the guardrail. He fumbled with the door handle, threw it open, stumbled into the cold night. He ran until his lungs burned, until the whistle faded behind him, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own blood. He didn't stop until he reached a narrow service turnout, a strip of gravel overlooking the black valley below. The fog shifted down there like waves rolling through the trees. In its depth, lights blinked faintly, too many, too deep for any town. They moved like headlamps in a tunnel. He fell to his knees, coughing. Black dust spat from his throat onto the gravel. He stared down at his shaking hands. Coal smeared across his palms. Under his nails, packed tight, the same black grit. It wasn't just following him. It was in him now. From far down the valley, through miles of mist and stone, came a single, long, perfect whistle, carried on the wind, answering him back. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.